Yeah, that was a lovely introduction. Thank you. The title of today is actually Panoramas, and it's supposed to be a workshop, but it's not. It's more like a talk. I'm going to lead you through early works, as it says here, and then we'll come to what I'm doing now. So like I said, this is it's not to teach you how to make a panorama. In fact, if you spend 15 minutes on the net, you should be able to do it. So I'll begin in the years when I was searching for myself in photography, which I still am actually, and hopefully some insights will come into being on how panoramas found me. My life didn't begin in this world of panoramas. I, also like many of you, a wannabe photographer, had no real clarity of vision. And if I was lucky enough to create some sensible imagery on what felt like a vision of my world, then that vision was very raw. It was untrained, even perhaps idealistic. But most importantly, it wasn't really understood by me, the author of the work. Partly because, like many of you in your early years, I also lacked that definition, the very language to communicate what I felt through photography with perhaps the audience, but much more importantly, the language to communicate that feeling that I hoped would find its way into my photography with myself. And even though the work would rear up with flashes of illumination on a surge of inspiration, yet it would always subside. And in part too, because our world is an incredibly distracting place. And that bombardment of visuals left me unable to draw distinctions between what was real and what was abstract, in what I saw and what I felt. It was almost like I was using my camera as a tool to fulfill my need to experience every single thing, every sensation, every stimulus, every color, all those ingredients that trigger my sense of order within this world. But more importantly, that stimulus that puts my sense of disorder into overdrive. Then instinctively and naturally, I would simplify it, both in my head and with my tool, the camera or lens, of course. We do like our sense of order, don't we? No matter how complicated, as in this case, the construct of the imagery. These images from my early day are actually a testament to that. The process of elimination, which in effect is a very simple process. Keep what you like, throw away the rest. Very, very simple. In fact, I still don't really know what my influences were, which brought me into this panoramic world. Perhaps it was someone from the art world who whispered, "Hey, squares and panoramas are in, rectangles are passé." Or maybe it was the appreciation of how wide-visioned Raghu Rai was and continues to be, as he always came away with a different image than the entire club of photojournalists producing imitations of each other's work. Or perhaps it was Raghubir Singh, with his not so Indian but yet sublime vision of India. Or perhaps it was a reaction to Steve McCurry's reproductions of Foster's India, or the elevating meetings with Lee Friedlander, with Mary Ellen Mark, with Bill Allard. Or perhaps it was just a khichdi of all and sundry. All these encounters perhaps got me thinking. This process of arbitrarily selecting what to shoot and what to exclude, which is exactly what I did in the 1990s, led me to ask myself, is this really what photography was all about? I mean, it's the days when there's no real discourse. Is this what I as a photographer should do? Pander to my aesthetic and even to my philosophical sensibilities? Was there not such a thing as a soul of a place or a moment to see, to listen to sense, and even respond to? Many questions. This, in fact, for me was a turning point. The bits and pieces that I had been photographing in the 1990s were coalescing. There indeed was more clarity. They were coming together to form a much larger picture, at first in my mind's eye, and with that image in my head, I could then begin to translate that into each individual pixel of information that led from that vision. And I did have an answer, yes. There was indeed a soul in everything that I photographed. Within it, without it. I just had to wait patiently around till I found it. And then to even more patiently attempt to capture it. Not just the brick and mortar, the linter, the cornice, the jali, or even the lack of it. Can we get that phone? Okay. But in effect, the very essence of it, the very mood of that place and of that time, if there was such a thing. Now the panoramic world is a very exclusive community. And there's a large community in the world. And even though the panorama word literally means, and I quote, an unbroken view of a whole region surrounding an observer. Unfortunately, the word panorama itself is tainted. And that's proved by several practitioners from all across the world, particularly in the West, and a whole host of mediocre touristy imagery with perhaps no start point and definitely no end point. In other words, quite pointless imagery is responsible. Here, of course, you see my underbelly, my earliest panoramic experiments, which you can see are quite flawed. On top of that, the panoramic scene has always been synonymous with cliches. That word that makes a contemporary photographer's skin crawl. Beautiful, sugary landscapes, to a point where you can almost be excused as a serious photographer if you were to think, now why on earth should I use a format that is not only so negatively viewed, but it also takes us right back to that British pictorialism which is so out of fashion and so out of... What would you do? I once came across an analogy of the life of an artist with a bus terminus. Let's appropriate the analogy for us panoramic photographers and let's make the bus terminus Delhi's ISBT. This particularly goes to all the students in photography right now. Some of you at this point may be thinking this can't be a very nice analogy because ISBT is not a nice place. Well, I urge you to listen nonetheless. This analogy mimics the lives of all creative souls who are either at the start of their careers, like some of you, or bang in the middle of it, like me. Unfortunately, I don't have an ISBT image, but let's pretend this restaurant is ISBT, and let's pretend that those light bulbs are the buses. Within ISBT, the bus bays are a bit like the bottles in this Park Hotel picture, each marked with a different bus number. From here, the buses travel to all directions, north, south, east, west. Their routes all start at ISBT, and several of these follow the same route for a period of time, perhaps a bit like the woodwork at the top of this picture. And of course, like all long distance buses, they all have various bus stops and dhaba stops along the way. Now, if you were to say that metaphorically speaking, each stop represents 1 year of your panoramic life. And I seriously mean panorama because I'm not interested in the other part of what you do. 3 stops would of course mean 3 years of your work. Now in terms of this pictures, you would of course be 3 stupas down from the start. And you can see there's a pretty long way to go. Let's say for the first 3 years, you set yourself the goal of photographing urban landscapes with the Fujica 617 or perhaps a Noblex camera. You shoot them all Ansel Adams zone systemed and tight. And your trademark style is a centered approach. Perhaps like your signature, your watermark, your statement over who you are. At the end of 3 years, if you showed this work to someone knowledgeable, and he were to turn around and say, "Have you seen the work of Christopher Faust?" you'd be shocked. And you would realize that what you had been doing in the last 3 years has not only been done by somebody with far greater fame than you've attained thus far, but they've already hogged the limelight for it. What do? You get off the bus, you grab a cab, you go back to the bus station and take another bus. A bus in a different direction. This time, you're going to piece together overlapping images to construct a panorama. Technically, these are called joiners, and you are a panographer. But you don't know that. You spend 3 years and produce a series of works that elicit the same comment. Have you not seen the work of the famous David Hockney? You're asked. Your work so resembles him. Was he your inspiration? Isn't it tough? What do? You're definitely in the doghouse now. Do you turn back? Do you look for another platform? After all, is there any point in doing something that's been done before? And that person's already not only hogged all the credit for it, but you would be counted like a shadow, like a clone. Do you go back and look for another bus? It is quite justifiable for you to think that there may be a certain way of seeing. And in panoramas, it is really about the seeing. That nobody else in the entire photographic world quite sees the same way as you. Do you then go back and look for that special bus that is meant just for you? Are you even likely to find that bus? Well, the answer is really simple. Don't run back to that bus station. Stay on the bus. For a while, it may seem that the route taken by your bus is the same as that of the more famous person. But sooner or later, you'll realize that you are pretty much on your own. Your bus is now charting its own course. And where Chris Faust and Hockney are headed is somewhere else entirely. It's not the same as your destination. The panoramic world embraces this philosophy. For the world you step into with panoramas embraces that larger vision. In a sense, you sort of develop this wonderful feeling of being omnipresent. This happened to me as well. With no formal training in photography, as is true for possibly most of my generation, Dinesh included, my ideas and my vision were very clearly my own. Add to that the advantage of having no internet, none whatsoever, complete bliss, the virtues of being in a bubble. You might think that without all the sharing and all the critique that you're perhaps more used to, what would be my guiding light? Where would my insights come from? My answer to that question is that when you embrace the larger vision of this world, that vision embraces you as well. Mind you, that's really what it is. And as you look outside and gather in the world in your mind, your relationship with it comes into sharp focus. You are then your best friend. And your internal critique is that voice that guides your way forward. Lately, I have even begun to think, and you'll have to excuse me a bit for this, exposure to this visual bombardment, of which we have plenty these days, coming from where I am now in my work, is perhaps detrimental to my inner image building process, which is that world that's not only so fragile, but it can be so easily influenced by this very, what's that word? By this very trending. So luckily, since I had no professor's vision to borrow, I had to build my own way of seeing. And my portfolio was based on what appealed to me, and of course, coupled with the hard fact of life, which was that a lot of what I was photographing was the commercial work that I would get. But in doing all this, something changed intangibly, and a new outlook was coming. In my case, what seemed like a course correction. You might say he's running back to the ISBT to catch another bus. But in truth, it wasn't the case. It was merely an enlargement of my vision, where my bus left that common route and began to chart a course in an entirely new direction. This all happened about a decade ago. I was reborn then. I called myself the panoramist. I had been warned by an inner voice earlier that being a panoramist would be completely a feeling of being sucked in. That inner voice warned me that being a panoramist would be an addiction, a deadly one perhaps. And I thought to myself, Oh well, let me do a bit of this, and I probably will tire of it and get back to photographing regular stuff. Squares, God knows. Who knows? I might even start to do daguerreotypes. After all, each subject demands its own format. In thinking this, I was really mistaken. For what appeared to be dabbling with a new technique, which is what I completely missed upon and was really clueless about, was the import of that switch. In effect, I was radically changing the way I looked upon the world. In adopting this, I was not adopting a technique but an entire philosophy. A dramatic shift in my viewpoint, which took me some time to understand. That you are the way you photograph. The thing about a philosophy is that it penetrates into everything that you do. The net result, my pictures carried that influence. The claustrophobia which comes from living in a large city. I live in building block like East Delhi, was acute. And this same claustrophobia, which was being experienced by my earlier images as well, was now absent. For magically, my need became my picture's need. And so, just like me, my pictures too desired that breathing space that they needed. The Monumental India book was underway then. The French publisher had sent me a copy of the panoramic book on New York that had been done a year before, for reference. It was filled with sugary, sickly sweet New York images, as I observed. What was entirely missing was the mood of the place. Now, since Monumental India was going to be its sequel for that publisher, I could well imagine that the brief to that New York book would have said, do not include people, because that's exactly what I had been told, even though finally I smuggled a few people into my book. However, it did not have to be lifeless like it was. Now, part of that problem was to do with the interpretation, my interpretation of what a panorama is. It's a technical interpretation. New York was shot with a Hasselblad X-Pan, largely. Now, a casual glance might suggest that my panoramas and those of the X-Pan might have similar proportions and are very much the same in that context. However, there's really a vast, vast difference. And that difference is the view obtained. The X-Pan takes a slice of what's out in front and composes it panoramically. In order to make a sufficiently large view, the photographer has to retreat away from the subject, with the result that contact and immediacy with the subject is lost. The very subject is now in danger of becoming a backdrop. With thoughts such as this, I set about photographing my book. The monuments in the photographs, birds, trees, grass, even the very hue and color. In fact, the very space itself cried out for more space to breathe. To a point that the picture took upon itself to express the union of the subject with its surrounding. Akin to a storybook without an ending, so too for me in pictures. In this one, a chhatri, a detail of a plastered wall, a shrub, a distant palace on the left. Even the texture on the front of a brass cannon, without its connect to its surroundings, has no relevance. For me, All these structures and objects and living things need their space, but more than that, they need their connect. They need their connect with that sky above, with the ground below, and they need a context. In some cases, what is being lost due to architectural distortions, as you can clearly see it here, because of the panoramic format, is regained through a widened perception, as perhaps comes from the feeling of capturing the whole, the scale and the detail, all in one. Much like a yogi who sits on top of a mountain to enlarge his worldview, likewise, I, from behind my camera, mull the relationship between things around me and their relationship with the cosmos itself. The scale of the world in sharp contrast with our significant and yet insignificant selves. Here, the magnificent wonder of the world, the Taj, is but a speck in the vastness of our inheritance. This life under the universe was to become a recurrent theme in my photographs. This duality expressed through panoramas, the expression of the grand scale of our civilization on the one hand, and the insignificance of man in the universal scheme of things on the other, was to me an interesting topic to explore. Sometimes this expression of the vastness of our world took the form of a dispassionate floating viewpoint. In this case, it was that of a bird's eye, which from the vantage of treetops sees our three-dimensional world in a different light. For me, the bird's eye view is metaphorically appropriate, as the bird from a great height, on the one hand, is able to see the vastness of the landscape as it glides and turns, but on the other, with great sight and telescopic vision, as it looks down on this earth, it is able to pinpoint that little movement and shadow that constitute its prey and its sustenance. It also knows and perceives that heady mix of scale and detail. Within this infinite world, little parts and pieces of the image arrange themselves in a certain geometry, much like a Hockney joiner. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but you should look it up. In resonance with the whole, and this forms the basis of my panoramas. Each part of the image then has a reason to be, to exist in this world. Together they create the very meaning they were photographed for. The different parts of the image then harmonize and perform for our eyes just as a large symphonic orchestra would for the ears. It is here in the images that the ebb and flow, the silence, and the climax can be witnessed. In this picture, the sun lays across a pattern on the floor to balance the ornate roof and wall detail. The balance and proportion of the fine structure is offset by the raw energy of the patterned sun. The real difference between a photograph of a detail and a grand panoramic image is that although in both the cases everything is simultaneously and instantly presented to a viewer, unlike, for example, a musical symphony or a novel where there's a build-up and a climax, the sheer amount of detail and the expression of that scale within a true panoramic image take a much longer time to grasp and appreciate. The audience response is much more experiential, as the viewer then has to reassemble all the bits and pieces back into a uniform thought. much like they would when they appreciate a musical performance. This is the very excitement. Sorry, this image not come up properly. This is the very excitement of being panoramic. The resultant image comes close to simulating the real experience, which you, the viewers, perhaps might have when you were to stand without distraction in the same spot and take in the entire view. In reality, of course, as photographers, you will know that the experience of the photograph, in fact, can be far more intense. Our eyes do a marvelous job, even though each eye sees like a normal lens. But if you were to add peripheral vision, then we get to see close to 130 degrees of view with our eyes, which is pretty much like a panorama. If then we were to turn our heads to take in a scene, our angle of view would be far, far greater. The act of seeing a panoramic image in turn mimics the experience of actually being there on site, of taking in the vastness of the view and then paying attention to the detail. Here, the changing hues of the sunset, the wash on the Taj, the birds flying across, the calm Yamuna is an experience that possibly took as long to photograph as it did to assimilate it on viewing it. Quite appropriate, since the visual experience in reality is a continuum and not a snapshot. For me, the resultant panorama might even be a square, depending on the view. It does not necessarily have to be long. As a result, there is no fixed proportion. The picture begins and ends where it needs to end. It is only in a panorama that you can really appreciate the tonalities in a sky. The various shades of cyan, blue, magenta that the sky produces boggle the mind. It is details such as this that I prefer to print my images large. To see it, you need to step in close to see all the details. And then to take in the full picture, you need to turn your head. It calls for a completely participative audience. Not like a screen viewing here, because you can take it in one shot. My craft of panorama is to me as important as the subject choice. Without the tools and the control over tonality, saturation, hues, there is a chance that instead of beautiful notes, cacophony is created and the message is entirely lost. This Nazar Pattu on the bungalow on the beach in Tranquebar picks out that bird in the sky, which then brings you to that Danish fort. In sharp contrast is the fisherman's blue hut in the corner of the image. Light, and additionally lighting, is a key to making panoramas that appeal to the senses in the same soothing way that the constant shuttering of our eyes does for us. As you may know, and you probably will, it's not easy to achieve these tonal qualities, particularly in a panorama, as one part of that panorama may be looking into the light, and another part, which is a joiner, may be looking completely away from it. But if you have the will, it's definitely possible. Here, while the plastic wrapped tiger is within reach of its prey, in this case, of course, me, and is being egged on by its mates, the bison in the other room looks on with nonchalance. It is in images such as this where the full import of the viewpoint of the panorama is felt. For it is here that you realize that you, the photographer, and both the audience are actually at the very center of this image. It is from the center of this image that this picture was created. It's like being in a vortex, in a way that you were almost a participant in your own production. It is no wonder then that one of the most common things I hear from people who see these images in a gallery is that feeling of being there on site. In the end, however, it is about relationships in our world, and a panoramic image is a very good way to express it, as I've found. Here, the relationship between two pleasure pavilions, one slightly bigger with a private room as well, not facing a beautiful lake but literally confronting each other. The relationship between a plain grave of a saint and the ornate dome above it. Between the detail and the scale of our man-made heritage. Between a famous poet's final resting place and the lofty but mature tomb it inspires for him. When I happen to look at panoramas on the internet, I often think that the biggest problem seems to be as to what to compose. For it is natural for humans to be greedy. So I figure they must be thinking, if I can add an extra frame to this picture, why not? The more the merrier kind of thought. What should have been a precise frame is not. Instead, I mean, these are not really examples that go with it, but this is a precise frame. What should have been a precise frame is not. Instead, the attempt is to show much more. Let me say this. Shooting a panorama is no reason to forget the golden words. Keep it simple. And if you are one of those that think, let me shoot more than I need and I will crop that later, mark my word, that won't happen. One of the reasons that it isn't happening is because the more the angle you shoot, the more the distortion you create, which is more often than not fixable in software. Another reason is that if you couldn't make up your mind while shooting it, you're not likely to be able to make up your mind later either. The thing to do is to actually see the picture in your head first, even before you raise the camera, and then to follow that vision through. Since panoramas can't be constructed in your viewfinder, you need to first see it in the mind. That's the only way to do it. You need to decide upon how the subject over your left shoulder interacts with the subject over your right, and how together they reveal in a certain way. Part of the problem with the word panorama is that people think it's synonymous with the great outdoors. A panorama of Berlin, a panorama of the Himalayas. To me, a panorama is just a way of looking here at Corbusier's work or at Lutyens' work. The look and feel of an image has a lot to do with the experience of photographing it. The advantage that comes first with seeing the image in your head. The tonality, the hue, the depth, the color are all first created in the mind then shot digitally now, and then the two come together to create that final image. Several times, the hues imparted are the colors of my feelings. This is not to say that I'm tampering with the very color itself, but creating a context from which where these hues flow, subtly enhancing, enriching, and subduing. So some images like this one will develop the warmth of approachability and singularity. Others may represent vibrancy, energy, and perhaps even contradiction. And remember, in the panoramic image, you have the scale to be able to attempt all this. Others yet, the red of devotion. Panoramology for the Sacred India book, which is my term now for photography, was quite challenging, with crowds to contend with and no place for a tripod. In fact, most of the book was shot without a tripod, as it was too unwieldy with moving subjects. The images overlaps had to be looked into and had to be planned in advance. It had to be planned over areas where there was least movement. In some cases, the series of shots had to be done lightning quick. In others, super slow. The results, of course, were quite rewarding, and of course it is for the panoramic format that you're able to get that girl and the entire scene on the street together. I often ask myself, is my job as a panoramist to simplify life on an image for an easy understanding of it? Or perhaps to add meaning to it? Or represent it through abstractions? This two-story structure almost seems to smile as it stands guarding the monk's robes. Perhaps it is, but I tend to think that if I showed the completeness of our world, automatically another and a more deeper meaning would automatically emerge. A meaning which encompasses the complex mix of emotions we humans have, indescribable and yet profound. Here perhaps it could mean return to the real world or else. Here on the one hand is tradition and the statue of Hanuman, and through its body a technologically sophisticated train is tearing across into the horizon into what appears to be a question mark. Perhaps a reflection of where as a civilization we might be heading. Back to the roots is truly my philosophy, and so my next book is called India at Home, which fingers crossed will be published in the next 8 months. With the sheer variety of homes, this is a rich subject to work on. In describing this inner world panoramically, my attempt was to explore the relationship of the inhabitants with surroundings. Within this hidden world, we live within our comfort zones and enact that tremendous human quality of becoming oblivious to our surroundings. We exist. As a simple saying goes, also true of photographers, if you see something too many times, you stop seeing it. It becomes invisible. Conversely too, if something is not accessible, we are likely not to see it, just like monuments in our native city, so we so happily ignore. Anyway, to get back to this panoramic story, I thought that since my images were stitched together to make the final panorama, and Upon stitching, they came out bulbous like this, they were not straight lined. I would treat this like my digital negative, which in fact is what it is, and run the images like this within the book. A bit Hockney-ish, but still my thought is to go ahead with that. What also makes this more appropriate in my mind is the thought that since our sight is not defined by a rectangular straight line, it is also much more appropriate. That straight line was a necessity of film and of the shutter in the first place, and with the digital and now with the panoramic format, I can clearly go closer to the vision I've always sought. These inner worlds reflect the vibrancy of our culture. Gods abound inside our homes. Krishan Kanhaiya's brother is an ordinary schoolboy in jeans, and the Godrej Almirah still stands tall, and our color television still wears a ghungat. The thing about shooting within four walls panoramically is that you have to be careful. Since the walls are close, the distortions can be most annoying. The walls all tend to yaw in the picture. My strong advice is end the picture appropriately and don't keep spinning unnecessarily. The distortion will be less and controllable in post-production. This picture of a wealthy lawyer in his home in Delhi is also very color coordinated. It's also inspired by Bollywood and Italy. Incidentally, which are the two things that seemingly are going for the country. The tones of the home reflect the era. As you can guess, this is a Khandani home in Lucknow. Now let me tell you about the methodology of doing this book. It was very simple. It is a collaborative process. My subjects decide where to sit, what to wear, where to look, and the resulting image brings out interesting facets of their personality, either based on their self-image or on what they aspire to be. Here, for example, they did not wish to acknowledge the camera and remained lost in their own world. This device of collaboration and acknowledgement completely knocks out the hypocrisy of pretense, since I strongly believe that my presence has already altered their circumstance. Lovely green blue hues here. If you ignore the fact that this woman is lying down, as part of our collaboration, she chose to creatively interpret it. This picture, shot in Pondicherry, places you, the viewer, within the confines of that private space, allowing you to scan details worthy of note and decide, for example, if she indeed is the dominant force in the house and he, in fact, might be feeling a bit blue. In this photograph taken in Jorasanko, Calcutta, the marble sculptures and the Venetian glass, we have a wonderful Indian phenomena of the fully dressed female and the dressed down male, all in the same space. In this Kashmiri rural home, everything connects together beautifully. The hues complement each other. Hay, jute, mud, gobar, cow, firan, skin tones, light, all within the same palette. The panorama too works well to show the cohesiveness of this home. In this picture of Morvi Palace, the princess sits on her bar stool at her bar in, of course, the dry state of Gujarat, in front of her Noblin paintings. In this Maulvi's home in Hyderabad, a bold mix of color accentuates the arch and columns rather unconventionally. Since my technique involved stitching images to make a panorama, and the fact that the process of photographing a panorama by its very definition could not be instantaneous, I started off thinking of myself as the experiential photographer. Each slice of experience adding another dimension, in which several random moments come together to tell a story. The next couple of images are about me, the director of my panoramic productions, and India, my muse. Shot in 5 parts, as you can tell from the squiggles on the side. This symphony of activity happened randomly. The result became a version of my truth. As in this image, the march of people matches the march of the British soldiers on the walls of this Haveli. The Rajasthani Gungat makes a stronger impact than the burqa. So as to make the point clear, this picture was shot in over 1 hour. And none of the 5 people on the road, save the worker from the house, were there at the same instant. Which you already seen before. I'm asked even today, do I Photoshop? Almost like it's a bad word. And I'm left thinking to myself, if it wasn't for this very computer, I couldn't firstly have constructed any of these images. Without PanaView and PT GUI and Panorama Maker and Photoshop, really, where would I be? I definitely would not be making this presentation to you. So to answer that question before you even ask it, I happily Photoshop. It's a great tool. But in my case, not to create an imaginary world, I mean, that's fine too. But as I saw it, with the ability of capturing a series of moments and joining them together, a photograph for me is almost becoming a story. In this one, he asked and then simply walked away, blurring the somewhat already blurry lines between still imagery and video. It's a bit like 3D animation, if you like. But in truth, this is for real. Most of you would be familiar with the decisive moment. My images become the anti-decisive moment. For in this image, many moments are decisive. And in turn, they all represent a larger truth, an act of faith in the form of a continuing ritual at a monastery. In the 1970s, an entire book of 100 images boasted in its forward note that it was the work of 1 second of exposure, the entire book. Well, no such luck for me. My work takes minutes and sometimes hours to shoot, and then hours to post-process. The photograph becomes the experience where knowledge is slowly gained and leads to wisdom. This image represents, he came, he looked, and he went away. Do you notice how the building is smiling at me? This is the story of a salesman who pierces his tongue and then goes to a temple to thank God for his health. If you manage to tear your eyes away from the magnificent baskets, you'd realize that you're looking at a modern man reflecting on the times when he was a village chief in a remote corner village of Manipur. Quite dispassionate, isn't he? On the other hand, can you not sense his loss? The big mustached South Indian cop straight from a Tamil movie is also a very religious man, as he opens his cupboard and pulls out 50 kilos of Rudraksh to hang around his neck and pray. A perfect example of a priest at a Banaras temple, covered in ash. Or did I really get that right? It's the same person. As to panoramically speaking, what could one do? I mean, the sky isn't the limit I once thought it was. There is a lot of possibilities left for me to explore. It's potentially an incredible future. I mean, I'm more and more treating it like a like just a tool to express myself, and with an ever increasing range of subjects that I'm applying it to now, which you will possibly see in later years. Thank you for listening to me. I hope you enjoyed it. We'll take questions and we'll talk, because that's what it's about now.
Can we have the lights on, please? And do we have the mics in the room? Amit, if I may just start, to me, yes, of course, there's a physical format of the panorama which you're following, but I, as a photographer, seem to find your sensitivity to light is what really probably distinguishes you from other panoramas. There's such a delicate and sensitive use of light. So the question I'm wanting to ask is that, do you do a lot of recce's? Do you stay in a place for a while, go back again? Do you find that the light wasn't right, or should I be coming back instead at 6 o'clock in the evening rather than 6 o'clock in the morning? Because your final photograph, I feel, has taken that into account rather than just the physical dimension of what you want to put into it.
Dinesh, I'd love to answer that I keep going back. I don't. Partly, I think I'm lucky, because I happen to always sort of kind of get it right. I mean, there is pre-thought about how you're going to attempt something. I find that there is a problem with this planning process of going back, and that problem is a creative issue. You can't keep going and recreating the same thing. You just don't feel right about it. I mean, I don't know if you've noticed that in your work, but if I had to go back and, let's say, try and photograph the Taj again from the other bank, I just couldn't get my juices going again and again and again. I mean, it just wouldn't work for me. So sometimes, it's not about. Sometimes it works, but sometimes it doesn't work. So I don't think it's about doggedness that comes into the picture. I think if you plan it right and you get it right the first time, or perhaps the second time, then that's it. You don't want to do it again. You come armed with technique, and that's the way I do it. I mean, I come really armed with technique, where I know my digital zone system, so to speak, so well that I can extract what I need to extract from that scene right there and then.
Hi, I wanted to know, now this is a very dynamic format, the panorama. What are the applications to this? You spoke about your book, which is sort of happening, and you do a lot of landscapes and architecture. But if you could talk a little bit more about the application and how well this can sort of blend into different spaces.
Well, the fact of the matter is that, I mean, you look at all existing formats. Your TV is gone widescreen. Your cinema is any case widescreen. Your banner heads on computer screens are widescreen. Your computers are widescreens. If you see it going forward, it, instead of going square from rectangle, it is going widescreen. I mean, already the advantages are felt in everything you do. Everyone wants a long panoramic picture over their bedroom or whatever, you know. I mean, beds are like that, sofas are like, I mean, I can't even begin to tell you how many possibilities you'll come with. But I think if you were to sort of talk about it from a let's say context of a commercial outlook as to how do I apply this now that I've learnt it, um, I think there is an incredible opportunity there because it is still a specialization, and it sort of produces a sense of the world that, because our eyes can't quite see it that way, it is something sought after. So I think, I mean, wherever you go, let's say you go to a factory or you go to a, there is always the demand for a panorama. Um, when I shoot a hotel, for example, all my room shots are panoramas. Why? Because there's no way I can get the carpet and the ceiling and from the TV till the bathroom door in my shot in any other format. I can't do it. I do it in a panorama. It may come out like a square, but it is a panorama for me. It's stitched and it's created with parts.
Yeah, hi, this is Ronjo here. Actually, I really love the images that you have up here. I just have one question actually, how do you shoot people when they are moving, and is there any secret how to do panoramic images actually?
Actually, that's what happened in the Sacred India book, where the thing is, you do have to pre-plan and you do go wrong. But the softwares have become so good that you can sort of literally plot through where your overlaps are happening. So I mean, if you plan them over the dead areas, or because not everything is moving, you get it right.
No, I got one point there when you said, like you waited for all these people as in there was one shot.
No, so when you plan, so you already plan where your overlaps will be. So like for example, that holy image between the people who were with the pichkaris, the pandits, and the crowd, there was a gap area which was one. Then towards the latter part of the crowd, there was another gap area. So you already in your head, you know where it's going to be.
Yeah, I thought that's one of the very interesting images actually that I've seen, in panoramic actually. Usually, you see all these people, like shooting panoramic, like you said, interiors and all this stuff.
Yeah.
But with people, I think it's quite complex as a photographer to do it.
Yeah.
And the other thing I've seen is there was one image of yours, I believe, where there was a classical dancer which was on air. And you've stitched a panoramic, if I'm not very wrong. I can't recollect the image completely, but how do you do that?
You just have to plan your stitches well, and it's possible to do it.
Okay, thank you.
I would first of all say I'm very happy to meet the hermit in photography.
Sorry?
A hermit in photography, it's like watching a hermit in hermit's work. That's very beautiful.
Right.
And over a period of time, the silence is increasing in the pictures, and that's your silence which you are portraying in the images, apart from the skill part of it. So my question is, what do you feed yourself with, and what do you stay away from to do what you're doing?
Like you're right, actually. You stay away from noise. So I think we all have a really wonderful voice inside of us. We all do, and increasingly less and less people listen to that voice, and more listen to other people's voices. And I think that drowns out the very seed of origin, so to speak, of a thought. Literally, I mean, and it's true of critique. It's true of, I mean, other people's critique can never do it for you the way your own critique can. Really, I mean, if you, in your heart, you know what works. But but the thing is, if you're not in touch with it, so there's no way to listen to that. And it's true that you need to show bodies of work to suddenly get a jolt. But that little question that you have on a daily basis, you need to be really in tune to be able to answer it. So, I mean, that's what I feel. I feel there is too much noise, and there's no avoiding it. I mean, it's all around you. It's on your phone. It's on the moment you open your screen. It's everywhere. and so there is no avoiding that. In fact, I think it possibly needs to become all inclusive, is to use that as a positive rather than as a negative, which is the way I'm treating it right now. I mean, I'm sort of running away from something, but it's possible to treat that as a positive and use that once you've.
How do you treat it as positive? It's a very beautiful line, but
Yeah.
your
Well,
method-
it's like this. You know, it's like running away from what you don't like. But photographically speaking, that's like avoiding something that you have some feeling about, right? So the moment you action on that feeling, because there is a feeling. I mean, there's no denying it. So you can create something out of it, in positive or negative. If it's negative, you convert it into a positive by working on that feeling. You find very interesting things to say through it. So for example, let's say if I did not like Delhi society, okay, let's say the society, I could run away from it, or I could make an interesting comment using it, and it becomes a positive.
Amit, it was a fantastic experience. Let me ask you one small curiosity I've got. Raghudai's photographs in many ways are very wide angle. They may not be panoramic, but still they stand out for their huge expanse that you see. You also working in the same way. How do you pose yourself? I mean, how do you posit yourself vis-a-vis Raghudai? That's my one question. In terms of the fact that both of you are using, not exactly, I mean, not probably Raghudai is not using panorama per se, but he is using very wide-angle photographs to depict panoramic view of ordinary life. And you are going in another direction to use panorama per se to depict something extraordinary in the ordinary life.
Well, the thing is, I think.
Just one more.
Yeah,
There is
sorry.
one question. The other question is that you haven't. You've said many things. You haven't spoken much about the techniques that you use. I mean, not the Photoshop techniques. I'm saying in the use of your camera gear. Raghudai reportedly was using span camera. You mentioned about it. I was just curious whether it will be possible for you to share what kind of photographic gear you were using. Thank you.
Sure. Well, the thing is that, well, as for the Raghurai thing, I mean, I have no one to comment. I can't look at my work from a distance anyway. I don't think it's anything much, actually, if you ask me. I don't think I've done any work to qualify it to be anything much. But there is a significant difference in the way, in my philosophy. And my philosophy is based on the presumption that our lives are full of nothing much. And I operate that from that presumption. That I mean, I run away from climaxes, I run away from depths, I run away from peaks, I like the ebb and flow. But that ebb and flow is always the driver. And I don't think Raghurai quite operates that same way. So I think his bunch of images are always going to be about different things than mine are going to be.
Most of the time he's in the midst of people. Many of his photographs are full of people
Yeah.
and still shown in
Yeah, but I mean, you know, there is some rejoicing of life. I mean, I don't operate like that. I don't, come from a standpoint that, that life is a celebration. I think, okay, celebration's a part of it, but I mean, it's a very tiny part of it. But there is an ebb and flow. It's not the troughs that matter, because these are the ones that everyone talks about. I talk about the throb, the which is a bit boring, but that's what excites me.
They are not boring.
Hmm.
When it comes in a photograph. Very exciting.
As far as the technical aspect is concerned, I started off with a Manfrotto head, and actually the camera really doesn't matter to me. You saw that Lutyens image that was made with a Coolpix 3 megapixel camera, and it was printed Yeah, it opened out to whatever 3-4 feet on the book. It printed quite nice. It could be better now with the better equipment, but it was quite nice. So I'm not really a buff for equipment, but I'm having developed from a darkroom era. So what I'm clever about is that I can do darkroom techniques with my camera. So for example, while the exposure is on, I can do dodging and burning on camera shots. I can do stuff like that. I can do pretty crazy stuff that way. I mean, vignetting filters, and so I have a whole bag of things to, but they are all sort of they come from that darkroom era of printing your own prints kind of thing. So there is, I mean, still shots, a lot of dodging and burning happens, and I'm a firm believer of the lower the light levels, the more control there is over light. So I run towards darker situations rather than towards brighter situations, and I find that that sort of gives me better control on that light. The darker it is, the better it is, actually. In fact, when it comes to a point where it's no longer what the eye considers to be decent light, is when actually it's exciting light.
Thank you very much for sharing your beautiful work. I have found in many of your pictures there are birds beautifully captured. So I'm curious to know, were they present at that while shooting, or they are inserted later on?
They were present. They were present since it's in bits and pieces. They were there, physically present in that bit of that picture. But that picture was not contiguously shot with the rest of the bits. That may have happened later, earlier. But they were there. So they were a part of that scene. I mean, there is it's a bit of a hit and miss, but on the other hand, since you're doing it in parts, it's like building a story. So I mean, there is, I don't know what to call it. It is fudgery of a nature. It is not really a scene that happened all in front of you.
The birds are on the right position, right place. So that's why I was curious to
No, but then that bird is controlling, in fact, my thought process on where my frame should begin now. Now that I've got the bird, now where should my frame be? So my frame is now also, being controlled by what I'm shooting. That man's feet, if it happened to go this way, then my frame is going to also move that way to sort of then take into account, I've got this into it.
Amit, so I liked how you used the flaws of stitching, the shaky borders. I really liked it personally. And your previous images, they were cut out straight. What went through your mind while editing that you started following this trend? Because it doesn't appeal to many people, but
it doesn't actually appeal to many people. In fact, I do have serious doubts about it, because ultimately one has to be commercial about some of these things also. So I mean, the Sacred India and Monumental India could have also been this way had I put my foot down, but it was a commercial proposition. Somebody had to buy that book. So I have to, There are only a few of us who like this. The others find it quite disturbing. There was in fact somebody who wanted to buy a print, a lord in England wanted to buy a print only on the condition I would crop it, and I refused. But then later on I thought, maybe did I do the right thing?
but what made you feel to keep that, the shaky borders? What was the thought behind it?
Well, it felt sort of interesting, flip-flop, So because see, the thing is now, where is it coming from? It's coming from, I am simulating the real experience. I'm standing here, I'm scanning like this. It's an experience, it's a continuum, it takes time, it's panoramic. There is no edge to it. I mean, my vision's got no edge to it. It's blurring. So in fact, what I tried also is I blurred out my edges, and I said, no, this looks too fake. So it didn't work. So I said, no, let me now stick with my original edge that I've got.
I like it. It's not too mainstream. That's what it is.
what's the part which engages you? Is it the part of finding the frame and taking the photograph of the panorama, or is it the production of it, the later part of stitching it and making it into the final image, or is it just one continuum? And I'm asking you a stupid question.
No, I think it's an interesting question. In fact, I think both the levels are very interesting to me because, I mean, like in our old days, shooting was one thing, but developing and getting the slide back was another thing. In fact, most times it was very disappointing getting the slide back because it never matched up to that mental image of what you had got. And so I think both the levels play a good, significant role in your and are very inspiring and exciting. Of course, it's still much more exciting to be actually doing more the shooting. But I think it's just about a mode of getting into that. Once you get into that, then you get into that. When you get into the mode of, okay, now is the time to sort of look at the pictures, that's exciting too. Really, to sort of, work on those pictures and bring it to life totally.
Just one more, I just want to put this into context. There's a French artist here who had given a talk a couple of days ago, Pascal, who's saying that, and he does very intricate work where he uses painting and photography and sketching to make a final, collage. He said that he had the entire image, in spite of its detail, in his mind, and even though it took him 2 years to finally produce the work, everything was exactly what he had thought originally, and it had to be like that. Do you feel that that's the way you want your images to be, that what you saw then and what you have as a final photograph or a panorama, you want it to be exactly the same, or you allow mistakes to change and make use of them?
No, I enjoy the flux and the movement and the fact that I may change, I may feel different. In fact, you can, if you're sensitive enough, you'll realize your own inspiration is always going like this, So one day you'll be feeling like this, another day you'll be feeling like this, and so it'll reflect on that image. It'll reflect on how you want that image to come out. So it's changing, and it's nice that it has that, that you are able to allow it to change as you move along with it. It is generally guided by a single thought when you did get it, but enough capability for it to move into a different realm entirely.
Hi Amit. I was thinking, from the initial work that you were showing of the monuments and the hotels to the last work that you're about to publish now about the homes, there's a huge difference in the kind of subject that you choose. The monuments are in a way, they are actually public space, simple research, or you know about them. But the private homes is something that is completely different. They're not out in the open. You don't know that this house exists, that this family lives in such a beautiful place. And the images are strikingly beautiful in color, in composition, in the complexity of the composition. Can you tell a little bit about the kind of process that leads you to find these places? Do people write to you saying, come photograph my place, or friends, or how do you go about it? And then coming into these people's homes, most of them, or at least some of them, are not very much used to being in touch with the photographer who probably takes a little bit of time to take the picture. You don't just come in, take a click or snap. You come in and it's a process. So can you tell a little bit about this process of work?
You're right that it's a difficult one to plan out because there is no glossary of homes of India. There is a typology of homes which I throw out because I don't want to do a typology book. I don't want to do one Orissa tribal home and so I sort of treat it like an organic exercise from the point of view perhaps of where I am next, okay, and where will I be and what is it I want to see, and then I just ask around. I mean, in most places are very welcoming and they'll allow you in, and most times at short notice they'll allow you to very much be a part of them and photograph them. It's not necessarily the best way to do it, because sometimes people are missing, or the husband's off to work, only the wife is sitting there, and you have to take another time. But firstly, yeah, it is the question of finding the home, and I think till you actually go there, because I tried doing this. I tried hiring a person and saying, okay, now you help me find homes. It didn't. Obviously, it's not going to work. You can't find homes that way. You got to, when you go to, let's say, and shoot in Bhubaneswar, you take 4 days off and you just go run around the country. And when you go to Hyderabad, you already are in touch with your friends and you start finding them. In fact, more than homes, my next exercise is far more difficult. I'm just not making any headway, which is well, you saw that Manipuri man as a chief and so I'm not just finding homes, I'm finding people with very interesting different two aspects of their lives, and I have really not shown that here, but that's called One India, Many Lives. And that's really incredibly difficult to find. How do you find, for example, I have this in my head, I want a South Indian tycoon who goes home and sits on the floor of his kitchen and eats his khana. Now, I know he exists. I can't find him. I want a Calcutta beggar who lives in a palace house. I know he exists. How do I find him? Some of them I know, I possibly can also find them. But there are others I don't even know. I don't even know where to look. So it's a lot of hit and miss. You just go, you find, you talk, you meet every person, and then every person triggers a thought. So if I sit with Sefi and he say, oh, I went to, you went there. Acha, tell me about, so this is how it works. This is just how the network works, and you get your contacts. And these people are very welcoming. That's the other part of it. We're lucky in a time when they are welcoming. They may not be in a few years.
So you're going to just make your work more quieter and more difficult. And thank you very much, Amit. Thanks a lot.
Within it, without it. I just had to wait patiently around till I found it. And then to even more patiently attempt to capture it. Not just the brick and mortar, the linter, the cornice, the jali, or even the lack of it. Can we get that phone? Okay. But in effect, the very essence of it, the very mood of that place and of that time, if there was such a thing. Now the panoramic world is a very exclusive community. And there's a large community in the world. And even though the panorama word literally means, and I quote, an unbroken view of a whole region surrounding an observer. Unfortunately, the word panorama itself is tainted. And that's proved by several practitioners from all across the world, particularly in the West, and a whole host of mediocre touristy imagery with perhaps no start point and definitely no end point. In other words, quite pointless imagery is responsible. Here, of course, you see my underbelly, my earliest panoramic experiments, which you can see are quite flawed. On top of that, the panoramic scene has always been synonymous with, or perhaps it was Raghubir Singh, with his not so Indian but yet sublime vision of India. Or perhaps it was a reaction to Steve McCurry's reproductions of Forster's India, or the elevating meetings with Lee Friedlander, with Mary Ellen Mark, with Bill Allard. Or perhaps it was just a khichdi of all and sundry. All these encounters perhaps got me thinking. This process of arbitrarily selecting what to shoot and what to exclude, which is exactly what I did in the 1990s, led me to ask myself, is this really what photography was all about? I mean, it's the days when there's no real discourse. Is this what I as a photographer should do? Pander to my aesthetic and even to my philosophical sensibilities? Was there not such a thing as a soul of a place or a moment to see, to listen to sense, and even respond to? Many questions. This, in fact, for me was a turning point. The bits and pieces that I had been photographing in the 1990s were coalescing. There indeed was more clarity. They were coming together to form a much larger picture, at first in my mind's eye, and with that image in my head. I could then begin to translate that into each individual pixel of information that led from that vision. And I did have an answer, yes. There was indeed a soul in everything that I photographed. Yeah, that was a lovely introduction. Thank you. The title of today is actually Panoramas, and it's supposed to be a workshop, but it's not. It's more like a talk. I'm going to lead you through early works, as it says here, and then we'll come to what I'm doing now. So like I said, this is it's not to teach you how to make a panorama. In fact, if you spend 15 minutes on the net, you should be able to do it. So I'll begin in the years when I was searching for myself in photography, which I still am actually, and hopefully some insights will come into being on how panoramas found me. My life didn't begin in this world of panoramas. I, also like many of you, a wannabe photographer, had no real clarity of vision. And if I was lucky enough to create some sensible imagery on what felt like a vision of my world, then that vision was very raw. It was untrained, even perhaps idealistic. But most importantly, it wasn't really understood by me, the author of the work. Partly because, like many of you in your early years, I also lacked that definition, the very language to communicate what I felt through photography with perhaps the audience, but much more importantly, the language to communicate that feeling that I hoped would find its way into my photography with myself. And even though the work would rear up with flashes of illumination on a surge of inspiration, yet it would always subside. And in part too, because our world is an incredibly distracting place. And that bombardment of visuals left me unable to draw distinctions between what was real and what was abstract, in what I saw and what I felt. It was almost like I was using my camera as a tool to fulfill my need to experience every single thing, every sensation, every stimulus, every color, all those ingredients that trigger my sense of order within this world. But more importantly, that stimulus that puts my sense of disorder into overdrive. Then instinctively and naturally I would simplify it, both in my head and with my tool, the camera or lens, of course. We do like our sense of order, don't we? No matter how complicated, as in this case, the construct of the imagery. These images from my early day are actually a testament to that. The process of elimination, which in effect is a very simple process. Keep what you like, throw away the rest. Very, very simple. In fact, I still don't really know what my influences were, which brought me into this panoramic world. Perhaps it was someone from the art world who whispered, "Hey, squares and panoramas are in, rectangles are passé." Or maybe it was the appreciation of how wide-visioned Raghu Rai was and continues to be, as he always came away with a different image than the entire club of photojournalists producing imitations of each other's work. Clichés. That word that makes a contemporary photographer's skin crawl. Beautiful, sugary landscapes, to a point where you can almost be excused as a serious photographer if you were to think, now why on earth should I use a format that is not only so negatively viewed, but it also takes us right back to that British pictorialism which is so out of fashion and so out of. What would you do? I once came across an analogy of the life of an artist with a bus terminus. Let's appropriate the analogy for us panoramic photographers, and let's make the bus terminus Delhi's ISBT. This particularly goes to all the students in photography right now. Some of you at this point may be thinking this can't be a very nice analogy because ISBT is not a nice place. Well, I urge you to listen nonetheless. This analogy mimics the lives of all creative souls who are either at the start of their careers, like some of you, or bang in the middle of it, like me. Unfortunately, I don't have an ISBT image, but let's pretend this restaurant is ISBT, and let's pretend that those light bulbs are the buses. Within ISBT, the bus bays are a bit like the bottles in this Park Hotel picture, each marked with a different bus number. From here, the buses travel to all directions, north, south, east, west. Their routes all start at ISBT, and several of these follow the same route for a period of time, perhaps a bit like the woodwork at the top of this picture. And of course, like